It's funny, I never expected inheriting a dusty old patch of land from my late great-uncle, Elias, would kick off a full-scale, scorched-earth war with a suburban homeowners association. But here we are. When the estate attorney first called, letting me know I was the sole legal owner of Elias's sprawling 12-acre parcel outside of New Braunfels, Texas, in what I'll call Juniper Creek County, I pictured a simple, quiet side project, Maybe I'd throw up a modest workshop, keep a couple of rescue goats, just some peace and quiet away from the city grind. I certainly didn't imagine I was stepping into someone else's well-manicured, exclusive little fantasy kingdom. The land itself wasn't much to look at initially, mostly thick juniper scrub, uneven grades, but it felt solid, real Texas soil. But there was this one beautiful, naturally cleared spot, right on the southern edge, almost like a natural amphitheater, and I thought, perfect, that's where my workshop goes. So I drove out there one humid Friday morning in my beat-up Silverado, the official deed-riding shotgun, still warm from the courthouse stamp, coffee in hand, feeling like a proper landowner. And that's when I saw it. Nestled right in the middle of that perfect clearing, like a diamond set on my rough, unassuming velvet, was a structure. Not some rickety deer stand or an old shed. No, this thing was pristine. It looked like they'd ordered it straight from a fancy resort catalog, all high-end, maintenance-free materials, thick stone columns, a heavy cedar shingle roof, built-in benches surrounding a polished concrete foundation, even neat little beds of ornamental sage planted around the perimeter. And the final touch, the thing that made my stomach drop and my eyes narrow, was a large, freshly varnished sign hammered into the ground, the Cypress Vista Community Gathering Spot, exclusive use for Sterling Mesa residents. I just stood there, blinking, feeling less like a landowner and more like a guy who'd accidentally walked into a wedding photo shoot. I paced a few steps toward it, wondering if maybe Uncle Elias had been extra generous. Maybe he'd sold off a tiny corner. But that sign, that exclusive sign, it tasted wrong. I pulled up the Juniper Creek County GIS map on my phone. It's a habit from my surveying days. And within 30 seconds, the pit in my stomach became a rock. The structure wasn't near the boundary, it wasn't skirting the line, it was a full 12 feet inside my officially recorded boundary. A perfect, unapologetic act of brazen, fixed structure trespass. I zoomed in, took multiple time-stamped screenshots, and then, before I could talk myself out of it, I called the number listed on the shiny little Sterling Mesa HOA plaque at the development's entrance. A voice that sounded perpetually cheerful and slightly strained answered on the first ring. Sterling Mesa Association, this is Brenda speaking. Of course, it was a Brenda. I introduced myself, explained the situation as politely as possible, and asked, I need to understand what this structure is doing on my private property. There was this incredibly long, calculating pause, the kind that lets you know you've just disrupted a very comfortable lie. Then Brenda came back, her voice dripping with the sort of faux sweet, maternal condescension only certain HOA leaders seem to master. Oh, that, she chuckled, the Pavilion. It's been such a wonderful asset, a real focal point for the community for years, dear. Your Uncle Elias permitted it, you see. I raised an eyebrow, so high it probably hit my hairline. He did? I have zero documentation of that. Can you send me the lease, the easement, the license of occupation, anything? Well, it was verbal, she trilled. Elias was very supportive of the community. In fact, he sent us a handwritten note just after we finished construction. Proof of implied consent. I have it here. Want me to forward a scan? 2 minutes later, a grainy phone photo of an old, coffee-stained note appeared in my inbox. It read, Thanks for keeping the clearing tidy. Much appreciated. No date, no signature, no mention of land use, construction, or permission. That was their legal basis. That was their implied consent. I called her back instantly. Brenda, this doesn't prove anything beyond a friendly neighbor exchange. Oh, it's more than enough to establish historical use and implied consent, she insisted, the sweetness hardening into something sharp. Besides, we have maintained that area meticulously for the last 4 years. That makes it a necessary component of the community's common area now. I hung up with my jaw locked, leaning against my truck, watching the morning sun illuminate those crisp, new shingles. This wasn't a misunderstanding I could fix with a handshake. This was a sophisticated, quiet land grab. banking on my uncle's age and hoping that whoever inherited the parcel wouldn't care enough to fight back. They built their damn exclusive playground on my soil, and now they were acting like I was the trespasser. It wasn't their land. Not even close. I climbed back into the cab, drove straight into town, and pulled up at my lawyer's office. My attorney, a sharp, world-weary guy named Silas Croft who'd practiced property law in Juniper Creek for decades, was not easily shocked. He wore the same tweed blazer every day and drank lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. But even Silas blinked twice when I laid out the official deed, the GIS screenshots, and Brenda's flimsy, passive-aggressive little postcard permission slip. They built that fixed structure, Silas muttered, setting down his mug with a decisive clink, without a single recorded permit, no easement, and no license of occupation. Nothing in the county archives. Implied consent, he snorted, doesn't supersede legal title to a fixed improvement on private land. 10 minutes later, we drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It was sent via certified mail and courier, giving the Sterling Mesa HOA 10 business days to completely dismantle and remove the pavilion, restore the land to its natural state, and cover any associated environmental damage. I left Silas's office feeling a sense of quiet, righteous confidence. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. By day 3, the counterattack began. It started with a voicemail from the county environmental compliance office. Apparently, someone had reported an open, unsecured sewage pit on my property, a significant hazard to local wildlife and groundwater. I drove out immediately. The only structure resembling a septic system was a newly installed, fully permitted, bright yellow plastic tank, sealed and capped with locking bolts that looked more secure than my home safe. False report. The next day, I got a letter from the Zoning and Land Use Commission. Improper storage of hazardous construction waste, allegedly piles of drywall and lumber creating a fire risk near the tree line. I hadn't dumped a single piece of construction debris, but I drove out there anyway. What I found were 3 black garbage bags, recently torn open, spilling styrofoam, fast food wrappers, and landscaping plastic right onto the border. Planted, obviously. By day 5, a third complaint. Illegal removal of protected oak trees without a permit. The letter was stern. That one actually made me laugh out loud. The only thing I'd cut was some particularly vicious poison oak. This was coordinated. This wasn't just HOA petty annoyance. This was a municipal weaponization. Someone on the inside, likely Brenda or one of her bored cronies, was pulling strings, trying to bury me under a mountain of fines and inspections. The message was crystal clear: back off, or we will financially ruin you. But they had fundamentally underestimated 2 things. First, I wasn't broke. Second, I was now possessed by a sheer, focused spite. I immediately hired an independent, highly respected environmental consulting firm from the next county over. No ties to any local HOA politics. 2 days later, I had a 60-page report. No sewage risk, no hazardous waste, no illegal tree removal, nothing. Every single claim they made was pure, malicious fabrication. I scanned the entire report, highlighted the damning conclusions, and emailed it with a brief, pointed note to the local newspaper's investigative land use columnist. A week later, an article ran under the headline, "Suburban HOA uses bogus complaints to harass new landowner." That's when it got truly bizarre. I came home from work a few days later to find a large manila envelope duct taped to my gate. No return address. Inside was a generic USB stick and a printed sheet that simply said, "Watch this. Trust the old lines, not the new ones." I felt my heart skip a beat. This was beyond harassment. This was a warning from an insider. I took the stick inside, plugged it into an ancient, air-gapped laptop I use for emergencies. Paranoia, maybe, but I wasn't taking chances, and opened the files. There were 2. The first was a screen recording of the Juniper Creek GIS system. It showed the original, straight, rectangular boundary of my property, defined by the old surveyor records. Then, the video seamlessly cut to the current screenshot. Same map, but now the southern border had a smooth, unnatural inward curve, perfectly carving out a little pocket of land where the pavilion stood. The second file was a blurry photo of a printed email. The header was from a county planning account. The recipient was blacked out. The subject line read, "Sterling Mesa Border Tweak, South Sector." The body was chillingly short. Proceed with the quiet administrative update as discussed. Ensure internal logging only. My palms started sweating. They hadn't just built on my land. They had actually changed the digital property boundaries in the county's public-facing system to make it look like the pavilion was no longer trespassing. Not legally, not with notarized deeds, but just enough in the GIS layer to give Brenda the defense she needed. They did it quietly, hoping no one would ever notice. I sat there for a long time, the only sound the pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't about a structure anymore. This was about power, about the precedent of a wealthy HOA successfully manipulating public records. The HOA didn't realize they'd just given me a gift. Someone on the inside, someone fed up with Brenda's arrogance, was playing a very high-stakes long game. And now, I had the evidence. I rushed back to Silas. He brought in an old colleague, a former county GIS administrator named Donnelly, who now consulted privately. Donnelly explained over lunch. Most people think the county GIS map is holy writ, but it's not. It's a database. If someone inside has the right credentials and zero scruples, they can fudge the lines. He ran a few historical map layers, and there it was, in full digital display. The silent boundary creep, time-stamped to roughly 18 months prior. They planned this. They knew Uncle Elias was failing, and they prepared the groundwork. We compiled the files, screenshots, timestamps, the internal email photo, and Silas drafted a formal request for a criminal inquiry into the boundary modification, citing fraud and abuse of administrative authority. He also included a legal affidavit affirming I had never been notified of or consented to any boundary adjustment. The HOA didn't respond to the inquiry, which made sense, because Brenda and her board were too busy hosting an emergency town hall meeting, and apparently, I was the guest of honor. I showed up. Front row. Brenda, wearing a stiff navy power suit that looked like a freshly ironed flag, looked like she'd been rehearsing for this moment her entire life. She used phrases like community enrichment and preserving shared space. Her slideshow featuring staged photos of birthday parties and summer picnics at my pavilion. The narrative was clear. I was the hostile intruder. They were the noble, tradition-upholding stewards. Then came the kicker. Brenda put up an aerial photo of the new, curved GIS map and declared, voice ringing with false authority. As you can see, the Cypress Vista Pavilion rests comfortably within our legally defined buffer zone. No legal lines have been crossed. There was a polite ripple of applause until I stood up. I pulled out a large, laminated foam board I'd had made. On one side was Uncle Elias's original survey map, a straight, definitive line. On the other, the screenshot of the new, digitally faked, curved line. I held them up, side by side. The contrast was humiliating. Then I spoke, my voice calm but loud enough to fill the room. No legal lines were crossed, Brenda, because you had them moved. You falsified the GIS records. I have the dated overlays, and if anyone here is interested in what the county district attorney thinks of that, I'd be happy to share the criminal inquiry I filed this morning. A few people murmured. A woman in the third row actually pulled out her phone and started Googling GIS fraud penalties Texas. Brenda's smile melted into a strained grimace. Sir, we are not going to derail this community meeting with baseless accusations. You're here. I cut her off, my voice rising just enough to snap the tension. Because you thought I wouldn't notice you stole a piece of my property. And the only people who need to be worried about criminal accusations are the ones who committed the fraud. I didn't stick around. I'd planted the seed. The next morning, another envelope. Not duct taped this time, just wedged into the chain link. Inside was a new photo. It showed Brenda in what looked like the county GIS office, standing next to a younger man in a department polo. He was pointing at a monitor. On the back, scribbled in pen, he's the contact. Name's Darren. Ask about the stealth update project. I was done playing nice. They'd faked documents, manipulated public records, and spent a week harassing me with municipal threats, all because some smug HOA tyrant decided my land made a great patio extension for her community. Every day that pavilion stood was a middle finger planted in the soil my uncle left me. I stopped waiting for the court date. I spent the weekend reading the Texas property code down to the footnotes. There it was, clear as day. A landowner has the right to remove unauthorized, unpermitted, fixed structures built on private land, provided no lease or legal agreement exists. No permit, no easement, No legal standing whatsoever. I called Mickey. Mickey runs a small construction and demolition outfit south of town. We went to high school together, and he once managed to flip a double-wide trailer over in 6 minutes flat just for a local charity challenge. I need something gone, I told him. And I want it loud. Mickey didn't miss a beat. Surgical or dramatic? Make it poetry, I said. 2 days later, just after sunrise, Mickey rolled onto my property with a massive cat bulldozer, a flatbed trailer, and a Bluetooth speaker blasting Johnny Cash's God's Gonna Cut You Down. I brewed a pot of coffee, set up a folding chair, and watched the warm Texas light creep over the clearing. The first hit sounded like a freight train slamming into a brick wall. Mickey drove the blade straight through one of the stone columns. Dust exploded into the air, the roof groaned, and the cedar shingles popped like firecrackers. The built-in benches splintered into matchsticks. The fancy outdoor grill squealed as the blade shoved it into the heap of wood and concrete. In less than 15 minutes, the entire structure was a pathetic mound of rubble. That's when the HOA arrived. First, the luxury SUVs, Lexus, Range Rover, a couple of gleaming Teslas, screeched to a halt at the edge of my property line. Brenda climbed out of her vehicle, looking absolutely frantic in her crisp navy suit, flanked by 2 other board members. "Stop this immediately," Brenda shrieked, her voice carrying across the quiet morning air. "You are destroying community property. You are committing a crime." Mickey, without even looking up, shifted gears and demolished the last standing wall. I stood, holding my coffee mug. "Brenda, you are trespassing. You had 10 days to remove your unauthorized structure. You ignored the cease and desist. This is the consequence of building on private land without permission. We will sue you. You'll go to jail," she screamed, her face flushed crimson. "We're calling the sheriff right now." "You do that," I said, tipping my mug slightly. 10 minutes later, the Juniper Creek Sheriff's Department arrived. 2 deputies. I was ready, armed with a manila folder so thick it could stop a small-caliber bullet. I walked them through everything. The deed, the surveys, the GIS fraud screenshots, the environmental harassment reports, the newspaper article. I even offered to forward them the anonymous evidence about Darren, the GIS tech. One deputy read through the folder for a good 5 minutes, looked up at Brenda, and said, "Ma'am, based on the documented property lines and the lack of a legal permit or easement, the structure was built illegally on private property. The owner is well within his rights to perform a self-help abatement." Brenda looked like someone had just pulled the plug on her life support. Her mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. Mickey delivered the final touch. He scooped up the splintered, ruined, exclusive use for Sterling Mesa residents sign, flattened it into the mud, and handed it to me like a trophy. We piled the rubble onto the flatbed, and Mickey pulled out, leaving behind a perfectly flattened, empty square of earth. I smiled at Brenda, who was now frozen, staring at the ruins. "I guess I'll need to plant something here," I told her. "Maybe a pecan tree, or perhaps a new warning sign." She didn't answer. She and her cronies simply left. I didn't expect them to go quiet. 2 weeks after the demolition, I was served. The stack of documents was thick enough to count as its own small building. The HOA was suing me for destruction of communal property, trespass against the interests of a governing body, and my personal favorite, $100,000 in emotional damages to the community, claiming residents were now in distress, and one child cried every time they drove past my gate. I took it all to Silas. "They're overplaying their hand," he said, without blinking. "Time to go nuclear." We filed a counterclaim that hit the HOA like a tactical nuke. Unauthorized use of private property, construction without permit, environmental damage, falsification of public GIS data, abuse of municipal processes, harassment, defamation, the whole 9 yards. We included a formal request for a criminal investigation into the boundary tampering, citing all the photos and the stealth update clue. We even subpoenaed Darren, the GIS tech, to appear and testify under oath. Trial day came on a hot, sticky Wednesday. The courtroom was packed with curious Sterling Mesa residents, probably hoping to see me publicly tarred and feathered. Brenda arrived in a sharp, unforgiving black suit, her lips pressed into a tight, surgical line. Their attorney, a silver-haired slick talker named Mr. Reynolds, opened with a speech about the sanctity of communal property and tried to paint me as a rogue, antisocial element. Then Silas stood up. He didn't yell or grandstand. He simply placed two massive binders on the table, one labeled title and survey, the other HOA misconduct and fraud. He walked the judge through every single step, from the original deed to the environmental harassment reports. He played the video of the boundary magically shifting in the county system. And then, he introduced the photo of Brenda and Darren in the GIS office. Objection after objection flew from the HOA table, but the judge overruled every single one. Then came the moment that cracked it wide open. Darren testified. He looked terrified, but once he started talking, it all spilled out. Brenda had contacted him through a friendly board member, told him it was a necessary community correction, and he was paid an extra consulting fee, off the books, through an HOA subcommittee fund to perform the quiet, internal revision. The courtroom went utterly silent. Silas finished by bringing in an expert witness, a retired city planner, who stated unequivocally that the boundary modification was illegal and that the unpermitted structure had caused drainage disruptions that would cost at least $12,000 to properly remediate. When the judge reconvened, his ruling was swift and final. He ruled entirely in my favor. The HOA's claims were dismissed with prejudice. The pavilion was declared an unauthorized, illegal structure. Brenda's actions were officially referred to the district attorney for potential criminal charges, including fraud and falsification of public records. And finally, the hammer drop. The Sterling Mesa HOA was ordered to pay me $100,000, the full cost of the demolition, the land restoration, the surveyor fees, my attorney costs, and a punitive award for the harassment. Brenda didn't say a word. She just sat there, her face a mask of frozen disbelief, as if her entire suburban kingdom had turned to dust. I walked out of that courtroom not just vindicated, but armed with a new, sober understanding of how truly dangerous people become when they mistake petty power for absolute immunity. The fallout was immediate. Within 24 hours, the HOA's Facebook group went into meltdown. Posts disappeared, threads were locked, and people demanded Brenda's resignation. The next morning, an official email blast announced that President Brenda Winslow had taken a temporary leave of absence to allow the board to conduct a full internal review. Translation: they threw her under the very expensive bus. The final act of justice came 2 weeks later. I got a certified letter from the Juniper Creek County Recorder's Office. Inside was an official notice. The GIS system had been corrected. My property lines, the real ones, were reinstated, with permanent annotations flagging the prior illegal manipulation for transparency. A formal apology from the county was attached. I stood on the edge of my land that weekend, the infamous clearing where the pavilion once stood, and for the first time in 18 months, I felt genuine peace. No signs, no board members, no threats. I didn't throw a party or gloat online. I called Mickey again. 3 days later, we poured a fresh concrete slab. Not a huge one, just enough to mimic the exact footprint of the old HOA eyesore. And on top of it, we installed a custom-made metal sign, polished and bolted directly into the slab. The letters were etched in bold, gleaming steel. Private property, not for community use. Ever. Beneath that, in smaller, perfectly centered print, was the quiet punchline. A memorial to the most expensive $100,000 garden shed in Sterling Mesa history. The day I installed it, a few curious neighbors drove by. One guy pulled over, took a selfie with the sign, and gave me a silent thumbs up. By evening, it was on the neighborhood Facebook page. It went viral by the next morning. I woke up to memes. And the best part? Nobody from the HOA ever came to complain. They knew better now. They knew the line had been drawn, bulldozed, and then etched in steel. So, tell me what you think. Was this a proportional response? Did I go too far? Or was a $100,000 lawsuit and a criminal referral the only way to teach Brenda and the HOA that property rights mean something? Have you ever had to fight a bully like this? Let me know your own craziest HOA story down in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you think justice and a little bit of petty genius ultimately won the day.